Today I'm going to be showing you what is probably the most psychologically brutal chess move that Bobby Fischer has ever made. The year is 1963, it's round 2 of the US Championship, and the 20-year-old Bobby Fischer, playing white, opens the game with e4. His opponent, Larry Evans, a strong Grandmaster and former US champion, responds e5, after which Bobby Fischer busts out the ultimate trolling move, f4, the King's Gambit. To really understand just how savage this move was at this particular time against this particular opponent, you really got to know the backstory, which began 3 years earlier in 1960, when Bobby Fischer played Boris Spassky for the very first time. In that game, Spassky had the white pieces and played the King's Gambit against the young Fischer, who, after getting a moderate opening advantage with e takes f4 followed by g5, was unable to make the most of that advantage in this ensuing middle game, in which Spassky was eventually able to fully equalize. Despite Fischer having an extra pawn, the game was objectively a draw, but then, on move 26, Bobby Fischer committed a terrible blunder with rook to f8, allowing rook to e5, attacking Fischer's queen, who has no good way to continue defending the bishop on e7, which is necessary since after rook takes e7, the g7 rook will be pinned to the king and will not be able to recapture. If you try queen to h4, then there's rook takes f8 check, followed by queen takes h4, winning the queen. Bishop to f6 would work, if not for the move queen to c5, hitting that undefended rook on f8 while still hitting the black queen. So Fischer tries rook to d8, counterattacking Spassky's queen that way. It goes to e4. The black queen is still hit. The bishop is hit twice. Fischer moves the queen to h4, keeping defensive e7. But after rook to f4 from Spassky, the queen is again attacked, and now she has no safe squares where she can keep defending that bishop, and so Fischer resigns. This loss to Spassky in their very first encounter had such a profound impact on Fischer that he proceeded to do what many of us have the urge to do after a devastating loss, and that is, he wrote an article about how he should have won the game, because the King's Gambit is such a weak opening. And he went so far as to call it losing for white, saying that in this position, after black plays e takes f4 and knight to f3 from white, black should follow up with d6, which Fischer famously referred to as a high-class waiting move, and considered it to be an improvement over the move g5, which he used against Spassky. Fischer published his analysis in his 1961 article entitled A Bust to the King's Gambit, which appeared in the very first issue of a magazine called The American Chess Quarterly, whose principal editor was none other than, you guessed it, Larry Evans. So this just might be the most trolling move in chess history. Bobby Fischer is playing an opening which he himself argued was losing for white, against the editor of the magazine that originally published his analysis on it. To have the audacity to basically say to a former US champion, I'm going to beat you now using a dubious opening that I showed you how to refute in your own magazine, is just the ultimate in self-confidence or arrogance, whatever you want to call it. This is why we love Fischer as a chess player. So in the game, after e takes f4 from Evans, a move which both grandmasters and computer engines agree is black's best and most challenging reply, we already have a move from Fischer which he did not mention in his 1961 article, and that is bishop to c4. More popular is knight to f3, covering the h4 square, and thus preventing the move played next by Evans, queen to h4 check, depriving Fischer the right to castle after king to f1. Evans continues d6, activating his light-squared bishop, controlling e5. He's waiting on playing knight to f6, since that would block the diagonal of his queen, which he's expecting to be attacked very soon with knight to f3. So he wants to preserve the option of retreating his queen to f6 or to e7. Fischer continues with knight to c3, just keeping knight to f3 in reserve, maybe waiting until black has nothing better than knight to f6, and then he'll attack the queen. But for now, Evans has bishop to e6, challenging Fischer's bishop on c4, though there really is nothing wrong with the immediate knight to f6, since after knight to f3, Queen to h6 is good for black according to the engine, maybe even strongest, providing defense to that wayward f4 pawn, and then he can add more if necessary with knight to h5. Fischer defends his bishop with queen to e2. c6 now from Evans controls d5, so that after knight to f3, played now by Fischer, his queen can go to e7, where it will not be harassed with any knight to d5. But again, it would have been better to control d5 with a developing move, knight to f6, planning to put the queen on h6. This move c6 just loses a tempo when it comes to piece development, and it allows Fischer to now equalize the position with d4, establishing that ideal central pawn duo. With an attack on the f4 pawn, Evans captures on c4, and after queen takes c4, he defends that f-pawn with g5. It is the best move. He needs that little bit of extra material as compensation for the lead in development that Fischer now has, in addition to all his central control, which he now puts to use with the exclam-worthy move e5, threatening e takes d6, followed by knight takes g5. And this move e5's true brilliance isn't really evident after the move Evans played in the game, which was d5, which is black's best reply, but we need to take a look at what happens after d takes e5, bringing us to a very instructive position where white's best response is not that easy to find, even after I tell you that it's not d takes e5 or knight takes e5, both of which only equalize. Pause the video if you'd like to see if you can find the move that gives white a significant advantage here. And the move is h4? What is this all about? Well, white is trying to break down this black pawn structure. And I'm really curious to know if Fischer had planned on playing this move. Let me know in the comments if you know of any analysis of his that mentions this move. But this is a very advanced, engine-y sort of idea whose relevant variations I don't think we can comprehensively cover. But let me just show you a few lines, starting with e takes d4. Here the simplest win for white is just queen takes d4, attacking the rook, threatening bishop takes f4, followed by rook to e1, pinning and winning the queen. If instead g takes h4, then white can play bishop takes f4 immediately, since if the bishop's captured, again, there's rook to e1, winning the queen. If g4, then knight takes e5 is winning. When f4 is hit, g4 is hit, rook e1 is not far off. Finally, if e4, then white shouldn't take on g5 with the knight, but actually only can win by sacrificing it with h takes g5, after which the engine gives the following: e takes f3, bishop takes f4, threatening rook to e1, so after f takes g2 check, and king takes g2, the queen gets out of the way, the rook delivers check, and after something like knight to e7, there's knight to e4, which gives white nearly 6 pawns worth of positional compensation for his sacrificed piece, if you believe Stockfish, which in this position is not hard to do. Knight to f6 is threatened with the fork, as well as knight to d6, followed by the capture on f7. This is just curtains for black. But to get back to the game, where Larry Evans deprived the world of all this potential brilliance by declining to capture on e5, instead playing the correct move d5, attacking Fischer's queen, who goes to d3. The engine was saying that queen to b3 was stronger, with the threat of knight takes g5 to draw the queen away from the defense of b7, where the white queen will capture and win the rook. And there are things black can do, like play g4, which may have been what Fischer was concerned about. Maybe he wanted to keep his queen a little closer to the king side on d3, where she can help defend against a potential pawn storm. But after knight a6 now from Evans, unless white wants to expend a tempo with a3, which Fischer doesn't, then knight to b4 is going to come with tempo on the white queen. But Fischer sees no problem with that. He just continues knight to e2, so that after knight to b4, hitting the queen, which goes to d1, and long castles from Evans, Fischer can now kick that knight back from whence it came with the move c3. But it would have been better for Evans if he had played c5 instead of castling. That way, his knight would have the far superior c6 square to retreat to, instead of playing back to a6, as is the case in the game. But okay, Evans is playing it safe, doesn't want his king to remain in the center, even though he could have definitely gotten away with it since the center is blocked and Fischer's pieces have been moving backwards for the last few moves. But next we have a very bold and very strong move from Fischer, h4, threatening some immediate activity for his rook by opening the h-file. Evans obviously doesn't want that, so naturally he pushes his g-pawn, attacking the knight on f3, which Fischer puts to its best square, h2, where it's attacking g4. And the only reason Fischer can get away with this is because Evans doesn't have any pieces besides his queen that can participate in an attack on Fischer's king. f3 doesn't go anywhere, it just loses a pawn. And Evans sees that queen to h4 isn't going to work either after knight takes f4. If you try to attack the pinned knight with g3, then white has queen to g4 check, which will force the trade of queens, and after knight takes g4, white's position is much better, probably winning. So instead, Evans plays h5, a good move defending g4, but unfortunately dropping the f-pawn after knight takes f4, since there was no way to hang on to both of those pawns. And at this point, we pretty much have equality. The engine is giving knight to c7, or bishop to h6 is being good for black, when white can play g3, defending h4, then tuck his king away on g2, and everything is safe and fine for everyone. But Evans, probably thinking that he's the rightful winner of this game, gets a bit too materialistic now with the move queen takes h4. A move which is hard to criticize since it's not obvious that it's actually a losing blunder. I'm pretty sure that I would play queen takes h4, so what's the problem here for black? I mean, he is threatening g3, winning that pinned knight, is he not? Well, yes. But after king to g1 from Fischer, that knight is no longer pinned, and so white is threatening to take the pawn on g4, which will not have adequate defense due to the pin on the h-pawn by the rook on h1 to the rook on h8. So Evans plays knight to h6, a reasonable try, though any move by black is losing at this point. But knight to h6 adds some defense to g4, but Evans has another loose pawn, which now comes under fire after knight to f1, with a discovered attack on the black queen, which must drop back to e7, after which the h-pawn falls, with knight takes h5. Now white is threatening to win the g-pawn by playing bishop takes h6, followed by queen takes g4 check, but knight to f6 is an even worse threat, when white can follow up with bishop to g5, or knight takes g4, attacking the pinned knight on h6, depending on how black responds, of course. So Evans tries rook to g8, adding defense to g4, preparing to meet knight to f6, with rook to g6, once again defending the knight on h6 from a more active square. Fischer develops his knight to g3. Evans plays rook to g6, adding defense, but here comes knight to f4, attacking the rook, which goes to g5. It looks a bit questionable, hanging out on the diagonal of Fischer's dark squared bishop, but white doesn't have any immediate discovered attack that's going to cause black any problems. But that is about to change. After bishop to e3, knight to c7 from Evans, he wants to get this knight back into the game. Now queen to d2 from Fischer does create a threat to the rook on g5, since knight takes d5, followed by bishop takes g5, would win material. So Evans knows he needs to vacate that g5 square. He would love to play rook to g6 and add defense to his knight, but the f4 knight has that square covered, and so we have rook to g8. At which point Fischer has a very nice move. See if you can spot it. Actually, if you can just figure out which one of Fischer's pieces should move, that's going to be good enough, since there are multiple winning moves for this piece. So good luck, I hope you find it, but here it is. Fischer's decisive move, knight f to e2, uncovering an attack on that h6 knight. Knight to d3 or knight to h5 would have accomplished the same thing. The knight on h6 is hit by 3 pieces, it cannot be adequately defended, and it has no safe square it can move to. So Evans desperately attacks the center with f6, but after e takes f6, queen takes f6, and bishop takes h6, Fischer is just a full piece up, and Evans has nothing to show for it. He plays on for a while though. We have bishop to d6, rook to f1, hitting the queen, who goes to e6. Fischer plays bishop to f4 now, looking to trade some pieces, usually beneficial when you're up in material. We have rook d to e8, rook to h6, attacking the queen. The bishops come off, the queen goes to e7, and we get rook to f6 with the triple stack on the f file. Knight to e6 attacks the queen. She goes to e5. Fischer, of course, would love the queen trade, and he gets it after knight to g5. When the queens come off, and after rook to f8 check from Fischer, forcing the exchange of more heavy pieces, Larry Evans has finally had enough and decides it's time to call it a day, and in this position, he resigns. He's a full piece down in a simplified ending with a symmetrical pawn structure and not even a glimmer of hope. So it's back to the drawing board for Larry Evans. That King's Gambit apparently wasn't as busted as Bobby Fischer led him and the entire chess world to believe. Had Bobby Fischer changed his mind about the opening by this time? Or was he just playing an opening that he still believed to be losing, just banking on the fact that Evans would not know how to properly punish him? Either way, it was a pretty savage thing to do in a US championship against the former US champion, and a truly epic moment in the history of chess. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed this content and would like to see more of it coming your way in the near future, and I will see you soon.